Though he is startled when the CEO calls him into his office and reveals his relationship to the black boy, Jamal Lawson stood at the entrance of Summit Solutions Group. The shining corporate tower looming overhead he took, a racist manager bullies a young black employee because he believes the black boy is unfit for the company. Jamal reminded himself of the weight of the unspoken challenge that came with being a young black man in a predominant white corporate environment as the elevator ascended to the 23rd floor. He took a deep breath and corrected his tie before stepping inside. Today was the start of his internship, one that he had worked hard for and deserved. That no one here knew who he truly was, the son of David Lawson, the CEO. He had kept that detail to himself. He was not here to coast on his father's name. This was about proving his worth. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a bustling office. At the center of it all stood Gary Thompson, the regional manager who... Jamal Gary was tall, broad-shouldered, with thinning hair and a smug grin that seemed to owe superiority. His sharp eyes raked over Jamal the moment he stepped out of the elevator. Gary walked over, not bothering to hide the contempt in his eyes. He didn't even extend his hand. So Jamal. Lawson Gary said, his voice dripping with contempt. They finally got themselves a diversity hire, huh? Or maybe it's because you have the same last name as the CEO. He laughed, totally unaware of who Jamal really was. Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. "Excuse me." Gary laughed darkly as if Jamal had told a joke. "Come on, kid, you really think? You're here because of your resume. Let's be honest. Corporate has been talking a lot about diversity initiatives. Guess you're what they came up with." Jamal felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. Gary raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Sure, that's what they all say." Turned on his heel. "Let's get this over with. I'll show you where you'll be working." Jamal followed in silence, anger simmering beneath the surface. He had dealt with people like Gary before, people who assumed that his success had nothing to do with his ability and everything to do with filling a quota. But today, he wasn't going to give Gary. Gary led him through the office at a brisk pace, not bothering to explain much. When they passed a few employees Gary barely acknowledged, Jamal could almost hear the whispers, "You be here." Others quickly looked away. Gary said, stopping abruptly at a small. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he gave a polite nod. "I'll do my best." Gary smirked, leaning against the cubicle wall, arms crossed. "We'll see about that last guy who worked under me. Not the best spot. But you gotta start somewhere, right? Hopefully you can keep. Wouldn't want to waste everyone's time." Then once more, he lacked the same benefits as you. Jamal looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Gary shrugged, figging innocence, "Just saying you're part of the company's new push, right? People like you are all about giving you opportunities these days." His smile widened, a smug look of superiority. "I'm not here for special treatment." Gary laughed, clearly enjoying the power he thought he held. "You're not well. You've got today to prove it better." Get to work. Without another word, Gary walked off, leaving Jamal standing at his new, etched on his face. "Let's see if you can handle it without getting special treatment." Jamal met Gary's gaze steadily. Desk. The sting of the encounter. Jamal sat down and opened his laptop, his mind racing. He had dealt with plenty of subtle racism in his life, but Gary wasn't even trying to be subtle. And the worst part, Gary thought he could get away with here, was assume Jamal had no real power here. But Gary thought the truth. Not yet. The day dragged. "This is sloppy. You're going to need to pick up the pace if you want to last here, Jamal." Gary found a reason to minimize Jamal. "This report, did you even read the instructions?" Gary said at one point, standing over Jamal's desk, tapping a stack of papers against his palm. Clenched his jaw. "I'll fix it." Gary's smirk returned. Smirk. "Yeah, you will let me know when you have it right." Jamal knew exactly who Gary meant, the white interns who had already received far more patience and encouragement than Gary had offered him. in these few short hours. But Jamal wanted not to fall behind the others. Knew how to play the long game near the end of the day. Jamal had just finished editing his work. Gary strolled by, looking over the top of Jamal's cubicle with a sneer. "Not bad for a diversity hire," Gary said, giving Jamal's revised report a cursory glance. "Guess you're not completely hopeless." Jamal's hand tightened around. Gary walked off, clearly enjoying his little power trip. Jamal watched him go. Anger and determination whirled inside him. He had survived worse than Gary Thompson. "I'll keep that in mind," Gary snickered. "Don't thank you yet, kid. You have a long way to go. Let's see if you could survive tomorrow with that." Gary walked off clearly. Gary would keep pushing, but what Gary didn't know was that this wasn't just a job for Jamal. It was a test for both of them. Jamal packed up and left the office, feeling the tension leave his body. Gary would keep pushing, but this was not just a job for Jamal. Gary was here to prove something, not to make friends. When the time came, Gary would have no idea what hit him over the next few weeks. Jamal's routine became a regular cycle of work revision and enduring Gary's relentless bullying each day. Gary found new ways to demean him, using every opportunity to remind Jamal that he was in Gary's eyes. Nothing more than a diversity hire. Gary seemed to have made it his personal mission to break Jamal, testing him every step of the way. Jamal had grown used to keep his head down and focus on his work. The more Gary pushed, the more determined Jamal became. He wasn't going to give in. Monday morning, and a few nearby interns hoped you had some time today. Office buzzed with the usual activity. Jamal sat at his desk, already deep into a project. Gary strolled over with that familiar smile plastered on his face and dropped a thick stack of reports onto Jamal's desk with a thud, drawing attention. "I need these done by the end of the day. Let's see if you could manage that. Don't want to disappoint, right?" Jamal glanced at the pile, then back at Gary. "I'll get it done," he said calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. Growing even more smug, "Good. You could need to work twice as hard as the others." Jamal's hands tightened around the keyboard. He knew exactly what Gary was implying. Again, the other interns glanced at each other, but no one said a word. "I have it covered." Gary laughed, clearly enjoying himself. "Let's see if you can keep up with the real players." Gary hovered from time to time, throwing in casual jabs and criticisms. Here he walked off, leaving Jamal with the weight of the extra work and the scrutiny of the other interns. Hours passed. Jamal kept his head down and pushed forward. He wasn't going to. Jamal had finished most of the work when Gary returned, this time with a few of the other interns in tow. Gary looked over Jamal's development, then shook his head in extreme disappointment. "Jamal, you're not done yet," Gary said loudly, making sure the others could hear, "I thought. I'm almost finished." Gary laughed, a cruel sound that echoed across the office. "Almost doesn't count. Jamal, in this world you have either. You would be faster than this by now. You don't want to hold everyone else up." Jamal could feel the eyes on him waiting. Judging, he set his jaw, refusing to let the frustration show. "Got it. Or you don't let, and hope you don't rely on excuses when you fall behind." The other interns shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. Gary's words hung in the air like a challenge. Jamal looked up at him, his expression calm. "I'll finish on time." Gary's smirk faltered for a split second, as if he hadn't expected Jamal to stay so. The damage had done. Jamal could feel the silent judgment from the others. The whispers that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't up to the task. But Gary walked away. The tension in the air slowly dissipated. "Then let's see if you could keep up." Jamal had completed the reports despite Gary's continuous interruptions. He dropped the stack off on Gary's desk just as the office was beginning to empty. Gary glanced at the reports, flipping through a few pages. "Not bad." He muttered, his tone begrudging. "Guess you're not completely useless after all." Jamal responded, knowing any acknowledgement would just give Gary more fuel to mock him. "Better get used to this kind of workload," Jamal, Gary added, leaning back in his chair. If you want to make it here, you will have to work harder than the others. People like you don't get the luxury of coasting." Jamal stood here, fists clenched at his sides, every muscle tense. "I'm not here to coast." Gary smirked as if enjoying Jamal's limited anger. "We'll see. You've lasted longer than I expected, but we'll see how far you can really go." Jamal didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply. He turned and walked away, feeling the burn of Gary's words. But he had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let a racist bully like Gary break him. As the office emptied, Jamal packed his things. He felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Gary's bullying was relentless, and the pressure to constantly prove himself was exhausting. But Jamal knew what was at stake. He couldn't give up, not when there was so much at stake. Much riding on this, he had been playing the long game, keeping his connection to the CEO a secret, for a reason he didn't want special treatment. But at the same time, he knew the moment would come when Gary's behavior would catch up with him. And when it did, Gary wouldn't know what hit him. Jamal stepped into the elevator, the door sliding shut with a soft hiss. Though Jamal was here to win, not just here to survive, he had grown accustomed to Gary's sneer and constant belittlement. After weeks of enduring the hostility, he could feel the cracks in his own patience starting to whip. Gary had made it his mission to push tomorrow another battle. Jamal, as hard as he could always imply that Jamal didn't belong. His position was only a result of some corporate diversity initiative. He was going to excel, and Gary's bullying wasn't going to stop him. It was midweek, and the tension in the office seemed thicker than usual. The entire team was on edge. Jamal had been assigned to prepare the data for the presentation. But, as usual, Gary had found a way to make the situation more difficult. Jamal barked from across the room, causing heads to turn. Straight over to Jamal's desk, towering over him. Gary slammed the folder down on Jamal's desk, the sound resonating through the office. "You didn't follow the structure I asked for. This is sloppy work." Jamal opened the folder, flipping through the pages. He looked up confused, knowing Gary would scrutinize it. "You gave me Garrett. If there was a mistake, I could..." Gary cut him off, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, so it's my fault. Maybe that works where you're from, but here you either get it right or you're out." The rest of the office fell silent. Gary's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, hateful satisfaction. "You better this presentation. It is too important for you to screw up, and I am not here to cover for anyone." Clearly absorbing every word, Jamal felt the weight of their stares. Jamal's blood boiled, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll fix it, Gary. You know, Jamal, this is almost like you're proving my point. Give someone like you a chance. This is what we get." Jamal's jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might break thinly. Gary refused to let him see him break. Hours later, as the office buzzed with last-minute preparations, Jamal sat at his desk, reworking the data. He could feel Gary's eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to fail. At one point, Gary walked. Veiled racism wasn't even thin anymore. Jamal looked up Gary's gaze. There was a fire behind his calm expression, but he kept his tone under control. "We have enough eyes on us. We don't want to embarrassing the team in front of the client." Gary laughed, shaking his head, sure it would. He walked off, leaving Jamal simmering. He wanted to say something. Now he knew now wasn't the time he had to play this smart. His father's advice rang in his ears. Let them underestimate you. That's how you win the next day. The big client. He had spent hours ensuring every detail of the data was perfect, but he knew Gary would never give him credit for it. Presentation arrived. The conference room was filled with senior executives, Gary front and center, trying his best to play the role of a competent leader. Jamal sat toward the rear, watching quietly as the presentation began. Everything was going perfectly, until one of the clients asked a particularly technical question regarding the data. Gary hesitated, clearly unsure of the answer, and looked at his team. Jamal saw his opportunity. He stood up, addressing the client directly. "Actually, I can explain that all eyes turned to him as he approached the table. When Jamal finished the client, he nodded satisfied, and several of the executives exchanged impressed glances. Feeling the pressure of the room, Jamal clearly and succinctly walked the client through the finer points of the analysis. Gary said, trying to regain control. Gary looked as though he had swallowed a lemon. Gary was furious not only because he had saved the presentation, but also because he had done it in front of everyone, exposing Gary's own lack of preparation. After the conference, Jamal returned to his desk. "Good job, Jamal. I guess the extra work paid off." Jamal gave a polite nod, though he could see the fury simmering in Gary's eyes. Adrenaline from the presentation still coursed through him. He had done his job well. Even though Gary would never admit it, later that afternoon, Gary stormed over to Jamal's desk. His face twisted in a forced smile. "Don't think that small performance in there changes anything, Gary's in here. But I know the truth. You're still just a diversity hire." Jamal looked up, his expression calm, but his eyes hard. "I belong here just as much as anyone else." Gary's smile faded into a sneer we'll see about. "You haven't earned anything yet?" Jamal stood up, facing Gary head on. "First time I'm not going anywhere." For a brief moment, Gary's arrogant confidence wavered. He looked Jamal up and down, then turned and walked away. Without another word, Jamal sat back down, his hands trembling slightly. He knew Gary wouldn't stop. He would keep pushing. But today had been a victory, and there would be more. Gary's time was coming, and when the truth finally came out, Jamal would be the one standing tall, and Gary would be left in the dust as the office emptied out for the day. Jamal stayed a little longer, reviewing his work. He had a plan, and no amount of bullying. Gary was playing the long game, and he was winning. While Gary considered him as merely a diversity hire, Jamal knew the truth, and when the time was right, so would everyone else. Jamal arrived early the next morning, his focus sharpened after the previous day's presentation. He knew something had changed. He had shown his value in front of the executives, and Gary's facade had cracked. Gary seemed his face twisted into its usual smile without a word. He dropped a stack of paperwork onto Jamal's desk. "More work for you," Gary said with a forced grin, "after your little performance yesterday." Knowing Gary wasn't the type to back off easily, Gary was trying to push him to the brink, hoping to catch him slipping, but Jamal was ready. He had faced worse than this before, and he knew how to stay focused. "I will get it done," Jamal said evenly, his tone. "I'll make sure you realize soon enough." Jamal kept his gaze steady, refusing to give Gary the reaction he wanted. "Nothing away." Gary leaned in, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "You think you impressed everyone yesterday. You're not too comfortable here. You're still here because you needed to fill a quota." Jamal's mind raced, but he forced himself to concentrate on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to let Gary's words distract him later that afternoon. "Here, and you'll see that soon enough." Gary's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, straightening us. "We'll see about this." His phone meets me at 6 p.m. in the garage. The note came from the heart skipped by his father, David Lawson. "Jamal." Under wraps, Jamal could prove himself on his own terms, but now it seemed his father was ready to intervene as the office started to empty. Jamal finished his work, grabbed his things, and made his way to the parking garage. The underground space was quiet. He hadn't spoken to his father directly since starting the internship. David Lawson stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable. He was a tall, imposing figure dressed in a sharp suit, the weight of his authority palpable. Jamal could feel the tension, the hum of distant traffic. The only sound Jamal spotted his father's sleek black car, parked in the far corner, and he approached with a mix of expectation and anxiety. "Dad," Jamal whispered softly, uncertain of where to start. David nodded, his face staying grim. Jamal, for a minute, they stood in silence, the air dense with unsaid messages. Eventually, David started, "I've been watching between them. Gary, David said, his voice sharp, has been testing you. Jamal nodded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. It's more than testing HEK, a bully. He's not hiding his racism every day. Jamal's heart pounded. Knew his father was always keeping an eye on the company. Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. So why haven't you done anything about it? David sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. It's clear he thinks I'm just here because of some diversity initiative. David's eyes narrowed. I know, and it's worse than I expected, Jamal. David held a hand. Jamal, you asked to do this on your own. You didn't want special treatment. I respected that I didn't ask for. Jamal's frustration boiled over, and you watched me deal with this, letting him push me around, waiting for something to happen. Jamal shot back. David's expression softened slightly, but his voice stayed strong, and you handled it better than I could have imagined. Now it's time to step in. Jamal took a breath, calming himself. What are you going to do? David looked at him, his gaze intense. Gary has been gathering information on his behavior, performance, and his background. He has been on thin ice for some time. This is the last straw. But I need you to be ready for the moment when I expose who you truly are. Frozen, they had agreed to keep his identity as the CEO's son a secret, giving him a chance to prove himself without the weight of his father's name hanging over him. But now it seemed that moment was about to end. When Jamal asked quietly, David's expression hardened. Gary's been pushing for a promotion. I'm going to let him believe he's about to get it then. When the time is right, I'll expose Jamal's heart. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I know this hasn't been easy, Jamal, but you will prove yourself, and soon everyone will know who you really are. Gary will face the consequences of his actions. Raced the thought of revealing his true identity in front of everyone, especially in front of Gary. You'll be the one standing tall. Jamal watched as his father walked back toward the car, and David added, turning back for a moment. I'm ready, David. Good, stay focused and don't let him push you any further when the time comes. His mind was racing the reality of what was about to happen. Sinking in, everything was about to change. Soon, Gary would be exposed for the bully he was. Shown real strength. Jamal's chest tightened. He nodded. Thanks, Dad. David got into his car and drove off, leaving Jamal standing alone in the dim light of the garage. Jamal would be ready. He was not only the son of the CEO, but also soon everyone would know. The office buzzed with expectation as the board meeting approached. Jamal could feel the tension rising, but it was not just the usual preening nerves, there was something else. While Gary was getting ready for what he obviously would be his promotion, Jamal knew that this meeting was more than just a stepping stone for him. It was the beginning of the end. Gary had been straying around the office all day, confidence radiating from him. Caught a glimpse of his father, David Lawson, in the conference room. David looked calm, talking animatedly with the executives, including Gary, who seemed eager to impress. Jamal stayed at his desk, keeping his focus on his work, while trying not too much thought on the approaching reveal. An hour later, the board meeting concluded, and Gary emerged. David followed shortly after, his face unreadable, clearly delighted with how things had gone. Jamal watched from his desk, noticing the brief eye contact his father made with him, before turning his attention back to Gary. The two men stood in the corridor chatting amiably. From a distance, it looked like they were talking about corporate business. Both of them relaxed. Even jovial Jamal knew better. His father was playing the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As Jamal stood to gather his things, ready to leave for the day, he walked by the conference room. He wasn't planning on getting involved. Gary's smile didn't waver, but there was a flutter of something behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe even annoyance. David gestured to Jamal with a call out. Jamal hesitated for a brief moment, but quickly calmed himself, walking over to where his father and Gary stood. Jamal, of course, he's been around. David raised an eyebrow, his expression interested but neutral. Tell me about him, how's he doing? Gary's smile deepened slightly and Jamal braced himself. He knew Gary could not resist the opportunity to throw a few subdued jabs, especially with his confidence still high from the board meeting. Gary started his tone light but condescending. "Jamal's been doing okay. You know how these interns are. They try hard, but some of them have a steep learning curve." She glanced sideways at I see as he had Gary shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. "Nothing major, but you know how it is, some people need a little more direction." Jamal, a smug glint in his eye. "Not everyone's cutting out for this kind of work. Always equipped with the same skills as others. When they come in, takes a bit more time to, catch up." Jamal felt his blood boil. He had heard this kind of thing from Gary before, the subtly veiled insinuations, all layered with just enough plausible deniable to avoid outright confrontation. But this time it was different. His father was standing right there watching Jamal close his mouth, deciding he wouldn't let it slip this time. He had been silent for long enough. With all due respect, Gary Jamal stated, his voice calm but stern. "I have done the task." Gary's smile froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Jamal. The friendly fade cracked, and his irritation slipped through. "You asked for on time and without issue. If there were problems, they're not because I'm not equipped. They're because..." "Watch yourself." Jamal met Gary's gaze, refusing to back down. "I have learned a lot. Some people believe they can get away with saying whatever they want as long as they dress it in polite language." The air in the corridor went still. Gary's voice low and warning. "You do not want to get ahead of yourself here." His heart pounded. He turned to David, a forced laugh escaping his lips. "You hear this? The children have some nerve. Sure, but sometimes they need to be reminded of their place." He stood his ground and could see Gary trying to regain control of the situation. But it wasn't working. Jamal had called him out in front of the CEO. Now Gary was scrambling to maintain his dominance. David remained silent, his expression calm, but his eyes flicked briefly to Jamal, signaling that he was paying close attention. Gary, embarrassed by the silence, leaned in toward Jamal. Jamal's pulse accelerated, but he refused to show any fear. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment it felt as though the entire office had stopped to see. His voice barely above a whisper. "You better be careful." David said nothing. The silence stretched on. Heavy and suffocating. Gary stood there fuming, while Jamal kept his gaze locked on him. Gary's face flushed with anger, his carefully constructed mask of professionalism slipping away. He glanced back at David, searching for some kind of support. Silence with a calm but deliberate voice. "Interesting." Gary blinked his confusion. Evident what David's face remained expressionless, but his voice carried a subtle weight. "This whole conversation has been interesting. I'm sure we will have more to discuss later." Gary still, FLR'd, tried to regain his composure. "Of course, Mr. Lawson." Raised a hand, cutting him off. That would be all for now. Gary opened his mouth to speak, but quickly closed it again. Clearly unsure of what had just happened, he gave a stiff nod and turned to leave, his footsteps heavy. The tension still hung in the air. Jamal stood there, heart pounding in his chest, feeling the weight. David looked at Jamal, his face still calm, but with a slight glint in his eyes. "Good work today." Jamal nodded, thankful for the brief but significant exchange. He turned and walked away, the tension in his shoulders gently easing as he left the building. He knew the next time he faced Gary. Gary had been walking around with his usual arrogant confidence, totally unaware of what was about to happen. Would change. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, Gary wouldn't know what hit him. The tension in the office was palpable. Time all would become clear at 11:00 a.m. Sharp Jamal headed toward. Gary was standing outside the door, his expression smug but with a hint of uncertainty, as if he wasn't totally sure what this conference was about. The CEO nodded in his stomach but kept his composure, determined to stay calm. The assistant opened the door, and Gary entered David. David sat behind his desk. His face was unreadable. He gestured for both men to sit. Jamal took a seat quietly, while Gary settled in, shifting uncomfortably. He glanced between Jamal and David. "Thank you both for coming." David started, his voice calm but firm, looking directly. Gary sat slightly straightener, putting on his best professional demeanor. "Of course, Mr. Lawson. Whatever you need." David's eyes flicked to Jamal for a brief second before turning to Gary. "Gary, you have worked with Jamal during his internship." Gary nodded quickly, clearly, uncertain of where the conversation was headed. "Yes, Jamal's one of the interns I have been monitoring." David's expression remained neutral. "And how would you say he has performed under your supervision?" Gary forced a tight smile. "He is well. There has been a learning curve naturally. Some interns take longer to adjust, especially in high pressure environments like ours." David nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting, and do you believe Jamal has the potential to succeed here?" Gary hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He glanced at Jamal, his lips curling slightly. "Mr. Lawson, to be honest, I have had to give him a bit more attention than the others." Jamal could feel the tension building in the room. He knew exactly what Gary meant by background. "So you're saying he has struggled more than the other interns?" David asked. "His background differs from some of the others." David's face remained unreadable, but solidify his story. "Yes, I mean, I have tried to be patient with him, but some people just aren't suited for this kind of work." You know, the subtle racism hung in the air, and Jamal's patience finally snapped. He looked directly at Gary, his voice steady but firm. "I have done the work you have assigned on time and without issue any problems I have had from you, trying to undermine me, not from my abilities." Gary's face twisted with irritation, and for the first time his professional mask slipped. "Excuse me, you've been undermining me since day one." Jamal continued, his voice strong. "You've made it clear that you don't think I belong here now." Rising. "Mr. Lawson, this is ridiculous. This kid is trying to set me up. Gary has been playing the victim all this time, and now he is accusing me of David." His eyes flared with anger. His fists clenched slightly. He turned to David, his voice cutting through Gary. "You think you're smart? You could walk in here and play the race card. I should have expected this from someone like you." Jamal's chest tightened, but he refused to back down. "What's that supposed to mean, Gary?" His face wrined, and he turned back to Jamal's words, sharp and venomous. "You know exactly what I mean. This is what you people do. Set people like me up. Try to make us look like the bad guys." You pointed accusingly at Jamal. "You have been planning this the entire time. Haven't you?" Jamal stared at him, your heart pounding, but your expression remained calm. "This is all a setup." David finally leaned forward, his voice cold and steady. "Gary, I have been watching. I have seen everything and what you have done. You cannot believe this. He has been trying to get me fired from the start." David continued, his voice slicing through the silence. "Said has been unacceptable." Gary's face went white, the realization dawned on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "There is one more thing you should know." Gary's hands trembled, his face a mix of rage and panic. "I didn't know. I swear if I had known, it shouldn't have mattered. Your son," David nodded slowly. "Yes. Your son, the intern. You have been belittling, bullying, and harassing for weeks. Shouldn't matter whether he's my son or not. No one should be treated the way you've treated Jamal." Gary sat there completely deflated, his mouth hanging open, as if he still couldn't fully understand what was happening. He looked back at Jamal, his eyes narrowing in bitter anger. "You set him up." Jamal's voice steady. "I didn't set you." Gary's words died on his lips as he looked up at David, his fear now fully taking over. He tried to speak again, but David's cold stare silenced him. Gary's face flushed with fury. "I should have known. I should have expected this from David." David set his tone. "Final, pack your things. You're no longer a part of this company." Gary's face twisted with desperation, but he knew there was no way out. He stood shakily, casting one last venomous glance at Jamal, then turned to leave his footsteps echoed in the now silent office. Defeated, the door closed behind him with a soft click and the weight of everything that had just happened. David turned to Jamal. His expression softened slightly. "You handled that well." Jamal nodded, feeling both tired and relieved. "Thanks, Dad." David walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This was not easy, but now you have shown yourself." Jamal looked at his father, the pride in his eyes, unmistakable. "I just wanted to do it on my own, and you did," David said, his voice full of quiet. "Pride, you earned your place here." Jamal nodded again, feeling the weight of everything lift from his hands. Gary's sudden departure left a clear void in the office, one filled with whispers and curious glances. No one. Now Jamal could finally move forward. The long game was over, and Gary was gone. Summit Solutions Group felt different, spoke directly to Jamal about what had happened, but the change in his treatment was indisputable. Jamal felt lighter, as though a great weight had been taken off him. He sat at his desk, calmly reviewing a report, not feeling the same focus he had in weeks. Jamal found himself in his father's office once more later that day, under far more relaxed circumstances. The first time he was not looking over his shoulder, waiting for Gary's sneering remarks or subtle sabotage. He was free to work in peace, his competence and intelligence shining through without anyone trying to undermine him later. David stood by the window, staring out over the city. Jamal entered silently, waiting for his father to say, "How do you feel?" David finally asked, turning to face him. Jamal took a breath, considering the question carefully. "Relieved," he admitted. "Also ready." David raised an eyebrow. "I spent a lot of time dealing with Gary, proving that I could handle this now. I just want to move forward and concentrate on the work, on actually making a difference here." David nodded, a little smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You handled yourself more than enough." Jamal continued, his voice steady, ready to take on whatever comes next. "I wanted to earn my place, and you did," David replied, stepping closer. "You've earned your place here, not just because you're your son, but also because you have shown the traits of a real leader. I'm proud of you." Jamal smiled, a weight he hadn't realized had been carrying. Suddenly, lifting his father's pride meant more to him than he would have let on. "Thanks, Dad." "I appreciate that." David placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his expression serious but kind. "Now it's time to look ahead. You have a future in this company, Jamal, a bright one, and I have no doubt that you will make it your." For the first time, the path ahead felt clear. Meanwhile, Gary Thompson was a shadow of the man he once was. The humiliation of being sacked in front of the CEO and his colleagues had shattered whatever confidence he had left his life, once full of arrogance and entitlement, had come falling down around him, sitting in the little cluttered apartment he had rented after leaving the company. Gary stared blankly at the television. The news of his departure had spread quickly throughout the industry, and any hopes he had of landing another high-profile job were quickly evaporating. People didn't forget how you treated others, especially. He spent his days bitter, replaying the events in his mind. How had he not known? How had he been so stupid to not realize Jamal's connection to David Lawson? He had spent so much time trying to bully and belittle Jamal, only to discover too late that the young man had far more power than Gary had ever imagined. Gary found himself wondering about the things he had said, the way he had treated not just Jamal, but others. Over the years, he had built his career on tearing others down, convinced that his way was the only way to succeed, and now he had nothing to offer. The bitterness changed into something else: regret, for the first time. Jamal stood by the window of his father's office, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. He felt a sense of peace that had been absent for a long time. Gary knew one thing: his time as a bully had cost him, but he had no idea what the future held for him. As they left the office together, walking side by side, Jamal could not help but feel that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was wide open, and now, without the weight of proving himself to those who did not believe in him, he could. David asked, stepping up beside him. Jamal nodded, feeling a great sense of accomplishment. "Yeah, I am. Focus on what really mattered. Building something meaningful, not just for others like him." Gary's downfall had been inevitable, but Jamal's rise was just beginning, and this time, no one could stop him. Months had passed since Gary Thompson's sudden firing from Summit Solutions Group, but for him, the time seemed like a long, excruciating fog every day. The once proud regional manager who had traversed the hallways of a high-profile multinational business with his head held high woke up in his modest, drab apartment, sending out resumes and received nothing but quiet or curt rejections. Was now a man whose reputation had been tarnished. Beyond repair, no one in the business would touch him. Word had spread quickly about his disgraceful exit, and worse, the details about his behavior had followed him like a shadow, stinging every application he submitted. Gary was no more seen as a confident leader. Wrong line exposed for his toxic behavior toward a powerful CEO's son. Gary sat hunched over his phone, staring at the contact list. His hand hovered over one name, David Lawson, the one man who could still turn things around for him. If he could just get David to give him a reference, just a word of support, it might be enough to get him back on. His feet begged at him, but he kept him back till lately and took a long breath and clicked the call button. The phone rang twice before David, calmly and under control, responded. As usual, David Lawson. Gary's throat clenched for a time. He was unable to speak, his heart hammering in his. He had practiced what he would say, but now that the time had arrived, the words were frozen. Gary, David's voice. "You, Gary," choked hard. "Yeah, Miss Lawson. It's me speaking here." Sounded smaller than David had ever heard it before. David stopped momentarily before saying once again, "What can I do for you, Gary?" His tone lacked affection, just the icy professionalism that had always characterized David. Gary felt. The weight of it reminds me of how far he has fallen. Gary could assist me. At last controlled his voice, breaking slightly. "I have been looking for employment, but none would hire me. I have applied everywhere." David was quiet on the other end. "They either ignore me or tell me I'm not a good match." Gary felt his throat constrict once again as he waited for him to keep going. He pushed forward, the desperation obvious in his voice. "I realize I made errors." Gary said, his words coming out quicker now, his veneer of control. "I know I broke boundaries I shouldn't have, but I have learned from it. I promise I simply have. Need another opportunity? Anything to get back on his feet." He stopped collecting the last remnant of his dignity before. "I was hoping maybe you might provide me a reference, so they knew I wasn't that man." Gary's pulse pounded as he waited for David's reply. He could not hear anymore on the other end of the line. Think he had been reduced to this, imploring the exact guy he had bullied for a return trip down into the earth. He had been so keen to rule at last, but David's voice was icy and as always, you want me to provide you a reference?" Gary cringed at the question, knowing how sad he sounded. "Indeed, I know I don't deserve it, but without one, I wouldn't have a chance." Mr. Lawson. David remained quiet once more, but Gary could almost hear the wheels moving in his head when David at last spoke. His voice was laced with a Gary. David stated, "You don't deserve it the way you're correct about one thing." Quiet intensity made Gary's stomach plummet. "Jamal, my son, was repugnant. You undermined him, bullied him, said things I won't soon forget. You should have been sacked long before." Gary's breath choked, yet he sat quiet, knowing that intervening would just make matters worse. "I have spent months seeing you destroy others. Underneath your belief that you were untouchable, David's voice became louder, and you come to me requesting a favor." Sharper, Gary. This is about responsibility you never accepted, not about whether you get a second opportunity. Accountability for your actions. Suddenly, Gary felt a knot in his throat, a desperate reaction. "Mr. Lawson, please. I've learnt my lesson. I promise I'm not the same person I was before. I just need someone to trust in me again." David's sigh was heavy, almost calculated. "Gary, you damaged people, you tore others to grow personally. Now you're paying for it. Not one person owes you anything but me. And definitely not Jamal Gary." Tightened the phone, feeling his final hope started to fade. "I'll do." Anything he spoke caused a lengthy silence. Gary believed he may have survived, but only briefly. David's voice was calm, definite. "You made your bed, Gary, David." David said once more, whispered softly, "Now you have to lay in it." The line clicked and the call ended. Gary sat there gazing at the phone in disbelievement. His one hope for redemption had just been snatched away. Gary first understood there was no realism to his circumstances, which struck him like a sledgehammer. Simple way out of this. His actions had repercussions he had never really realized, till now he fell. David Lawson's hands trembling on the table would not provide any brilliant reference for the phone. No simple. After the world had gone on without him, Gary was left to gather up the fragments of his former existence. He sunk onto the sofa, the weight of his decisions bearing down. Life he had wrecked with his own conceit alone. Although he had been playing the game for years, in the end, it had caught up with him, and now there was. When David Lawson summoned Jamal in for a meeting, the sun filtered. It was a peaceful day in his office. Via the big windows, creating a cozy warmth on Jamal's desk's PO wood. Arrived with a laid-back grin, more assured and in line with his performance than in the months before Gary's. Departure had been transforming, not just for the business, but also for Jamal personally. He had entered his. Understanding he had earned his spot, David sat back in his chair with a fresh sense of direction. "A little." Jamal nodded, seated across from him, smiling and asking how things were doing. "Pretty. Actually, with the new initiatives, the team is at last finding its footing." David nodded to indicate approbation. Jamal seemed to have done a great job. However, there was something in his. "Good things have come of note." Father's voice caused him to lift an eyebrow. "David, you sound like you have something on your mind." Laughed softly. "It's about Jamal's look changed slightly. Hadn't considered Gary in some time, not since the guy had been sacked and vanished from the company's orbit." David moved closer, his countenance softening, calling me a few days earlier, pleading for a reference Jamal's eyes. "Surprised you're joking." David shook his head. He was desperate. Nobody would employ him without one. He sounded like a broken man. Jamal grimaced slightly at remembrance of Gary's nasty nature. Words were vivid in his thoughts. "What did you say, David?" I told, with a somewhat austere voice. Jamal reclined back, allowing the weight of his bed make sense. He had created it, but now he had to lay in it. The knowledge that the guy who had worked so hard to achieve something strangely fulfilling sank in there. Now, Jamal was dealing with the fallout from his actions. "Wow, Jamal," said softly, shaking his head. I find it hard that he had the courage to ask. David laughed once more. Guys like Gary always. I wasn't going to allow him. Do they believe they can avoid the repercussions by just saying the correct things? After all, Jamal nodded. Walk away from what he'd done. I suppose it would bring closure sweeping over him. The conclusion of that David's smile softened even more, a pleased sparkle in his eyes. This is due of how you handled yourself, Jamal. You might have screamed out, made things messy, but you didn't let your job suffer. Your honesty speaks for you. Jamal grinned, feeling a surge of pride, thanks, Dad. David rose, stepping up to his son, and laying a hand on his shoulder. You have shown yourself in more than one Jamal and I could be more pleased of. There was no more question about the man you have become. Jamal glanced up at his father, the weight of his words there. About his position in the business or in the environment he had encountered, he had addressed the obstacles squarely, and now he was stronger for it. Thanks, Jamal, standing as well. I wouldn't have arrived without your help. David grinned. It has been a delight to see Jamal flourish. I believe there is much more ahead of you both. Side by side, gazing out at the metropolitan skyline, Jamal had great satisfaction as the future was just open, and Jamal had emerged, and he was ready for whatever came next. The weight of the past was behind him. The long game was over. Victorious not just in the workplace, but also in life. Closing the chapter Gary Thompson was destined to write.